The Human Experience. Inside the Humanities at Stanford University. humanexperience.stanford.edu.
When I talk about the influence of ancient Rome in America in the 18th and 19th century, I say that it was the wallpaper of the world. It was really hard to go anywhere in America without being confronted with evidence that Americans loved ancient Rome. So Latin was at the core of elite education, especially for boys, but also increasingly for girls. So you would have learned Latin in the way that Americans today learn a foreign language in school, like French or Spanish. By the time they got to college, they could expect at least 50% of their time to be taken with more Latin, Greek, and also classical history. So people who graduated from college, it wasn't a lot of people, but the people who did knew really a lot about the ancient Roman world. They also were infatuated with the idea of covering their houses with evidence of ancient Roman culture. They never had real artifacts from ancient Rome. Maybe a few people might have a coin collection, for example, with authentic coins. But mostly they liked to decorate in a style that we call neoclassical, which meant using architectural elements like columns that were Roman, or gesturing to Roman ideas. And they like to have furniture in the style of ancient Rome. And certain pieces of furniture, like the sofa, were in fact modeled on ancient Roman precedents. American women during a certain period between about 1800 and 1830 liked to dress in a certain style of clothing that today people called empire style, but in fact at the time was called a Grecian robe. In their conception of government, they thought very deeply about ancient Rome, the idea of having a wise body in the legislature. The Senate is based in part on Roman precedents. Their worries about how much power to lodge in an executive is very much a Roman question. Questions about whether to have a standing army and the moral problems of a standing army versus a citizen army. I think I could be of use to the museum because I could help them to craft the kind of story that we were going to tell about these two very different kinds of objects. We had objects from ancient Rome, and then we had objects from 2,000 years later from American history between roughly 1750 and the present. So what were we going to say about all of these objects? And we settled on telling several overlapping but distinct stories about the place of, for example, of Roman culture and the arts and family life in American history, the place of Roman governmental ideals in American history. And then we also told what I think is perhaps the most striking story, which is the story of the Roman Empire in American history and the transition from a simple republic early in Rome's history to a vast kind of almost globe-spanning empire later in its history. And that story, from republic to empire, is really what has captivated Americans. Why were the Founding Fathers interested in ancient Rome if they themselves were trying to rid themselves of an imperial power, that is, Britain, which was the largest empire in the world since ancient Rome? And it's true, the founders actually loved Rome because it was a republic, and that is what they tried to emulate when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, when they wrote the Constitution. Later Americans, though, began to be much more interested in the Roman Empire as the United States began this sort of relentless expansion across the continent and then across the oceans. The image of the Roman Empire as opposed to the Roman Republic began to really capture their attention. This has especially been the case, of course, in the last 10 years, when a number of books have come out with questions on their titles that are very blunt. Are we Rome is one of the pervasive questions that Americans are asking themselves today. So the question, are we Rome? Is America Rome? It's not just a political question. It's always a moral question, and it's always a question about the future. It's a moral question because we're never sure whether being an empire is a good thing or a bad thing. Empires bring many good things to people. They bring cosmopolitan culture, they bring citizenship to vast numbers of people, but they also bring war, they bring violence, they bring sometimes very oppressive regimes. Americans aren't sure whether they embrace the idea of empire or whether they reject the idea of empire. They're very unsure whether they themselves are an empire. Americans have always been captured by the question, are we an empire? Because they have followed very carefully the fate of the Roman Empire. And we know that the Roman Empire rose, but we also know that the Roman Empire fell. One of the most famous books of history, of course, is Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was published during the era of the American Revolution. And it gave to Americans and to Europeans this driving question, you know, if you say that you are an empire, will you also fall? So Americans, I think, today are asking themselves that question. If we decide that we are an empire, does that mean that a kind of ignoble fall awaits us in the future? And what will be the source of that fall? Will it be internal moral rot and corruption, or will it be external attack? The dangers are real on both counts, and I think that's one of the reasons why Americans have been preoccupied with the question of whether we are an empire in the image of Rome.